Today, masks and vaccines and COVID as endemic or not. Social media discussing nuclear weapons use by Vladimir Putin. Inflation is rampant, but that aside, try the bank for American money now touching $1.41 for a greenback. Oh, and rising taxes for Canadians. Is there enough insanity for you yet? Wait, the cold weather hasn't arrived. Welcome to Shurman Unlimited.
You wanted real talk, and this is where you'll hear it. Uninhibited by the toxic influences of cancel culture, unvarnished and unfettered, unencumbered by the censorship of traditional radio, uncontaminated by big media interests.
And now, Shurman Unlimited.
I spend a fair amount of time on social media. Do I post? Yes, sometimes I do. Do I get into Twitter battles? No, but social media, despite all of the bots and the trolls and the crazies, is one of the best ways for anybody to get a sense of how people are thinking about the issues of the day. I've seen fear being expressed in various ways ever since Putin announced, not surprisingly, that he was annexing 4 Ukrainian territories, and that these places, essentially provinces on the east side of Ukraine abutting Russia, are indeed now part of Russia. More simply, it's like the American military holding a door-to-door referendum in Ontario, where the question is, do you want to be part of the United States, and pointing the barrel of a gun at each voter during the process. Does that sound absolutely ridiculous? Yes, because it is. But that's what Russia did with Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And Crimea to the south was once the extreme tip of Ukraine, but Russia annexed that 8 years ago, also to a lot of hoots and hollers from the same places. But hey, Crimea is still under Russian control and does operate as part of Russia. Of course, this action is being widely condemned in the West. Obviously, Ukraine is hopping mad, and the United Nations has denounced it, but with some notable abstentions from the likes of China, India, Brazil, and others. Ukraine, funded and using war materiel supplied by the United States, Canada, Western European countries, will continue fighting. But Putin changes the rules to suit himself, and about as often as we all change our socks. Here's a brief clip of U.S. President Joe Biden's reaction.
America is fully prepared with our NATO allies to defend every single inch of NATO territory. Every single inch. So, Mr. Putin, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Every inch. And I've been in close touch with our allies. We're announcing new sanctions today as well, that including new authorities to sanction anyone who provides political or economic support to Russia's fraudulent territorial claims. And I've been in close touch with our NATO allies, who are united in our resolve to take on his aggression.
The G7 affirms it will never recognize the 4 territories as part of Russia. So does the EU. How terrified of all the noise do you think Vladimir Putin is? Well, you don't have to like him, I don't. But he's got balls of steel. There will be more severe sanctions applied to Russia, and it will find itself in the position of top international pariah, mostly cut off from the majority of civilized nations. Where did all of this come from? Well, for starters, Putin seems to have assumed he'd handle Ukraine in short order and assume control, but he found out that his own army regulars were not up to snuff and were not terribly invested in this misadventure. They've been losing against Ukraine. Now, in tandem with the sham referenda and subsequent annexations, he's sending in 300,000 more fighters. Except they aren't fighters. They're barely trained young men who have no wish to leave home and fight for Mother Russia in a cause they don't care about. Russian air, rail, and road travel has been jammed going outbound one way ever since the call-up was announced. Putin continues to warn of nuclear consequences if the rest of us keep supporting Ukraine and if Ukrainian fighters don't vacate these so-called new Russian territories. Is Putin crazy? Well, on some level, I suppose he is. No sane individual makes these kinds of threats, and in Putin's case, we should believe he'd do what he's warned he would. For those who think of giant mushroom clouds, take a breath. My instincts tell me that Putin will make some more noise, do some more saber rattling, issue dire warnings to Ukraine to vacate his 4 new states. They won't. He'll likely deploy 1 or 2 battlefield nuclear devices. That'll get everybody's attention. Battlefield nukes, or tactical nukes as they're called, have no cut-and-dried descriptive, except to say they're not strategic weapons, like the monster ones we faced if, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated. The risk is that tactical nuclear weapons can lead to a rapid escalation of a war actually employing strategic weapons. We don't want that. We don't want any nuclear weapons. But it has led to proposals being made within NATO and other organizations over time to place limitations on the stockpiling and use of tactical weapons. When the Cold War came to an end in 1991, the U.S. and the Soviet Union withdrew most of their tactical nuclear weapons from deployment and disposed of them. There were thousands of them, but estimates were 230 American and 1,000 to 2,000 Russian Federation warheads in 2021. Bear in mind who you're dealing with here, and you know the estimates are just conjecture. No tactical nuclear weapon has ever been used in a combat situation. This is not anything we, and by we I mean the world, not anything we need right now. Really, never, but certainly not now. We're hardly out of the woods with COVID. The ensuing financial cock-up has brought countries to their knees and made more families hungry and homeless. By the looks of things, everyday Russians don't seem supportive either. Putin is the issue, not Ukraine, not Russia, not the rest of us. I'd shed no tears if he just disappeared, like so many living under him already have. I'm Peter Shurman.
In your face.
There's a huge push for people to get out to their local pharmacies or other places where the new bivalent vaccines are being dispensed. Some call it the 5th shot or the Omicron vaccine or the 3rd booster, whatever you want to call it. From the scarce reporting I've seen of it, it isn't flying off the shelves. In the United States, total take-up is under 2% of American adults. In Canada, it's likely less than that, if only because availability to all persons 18 plus has been the reality for only a couple of weeks. I'm not anti-vaccine, and I don't tell anyone what to think or do about all this. I have said, and I'll say again, that I had a bit of an epiphany after my first booster. In other words, after my 3rd shot. I simply decided that was it for me. For me. I know many people who can't wait for the next dose and are near the front of the line when the next shot becomes available near them. I'm just not one of them, and there's reason. Keep listening. I'm also not against masking, and no, I don't think the pandemic has gone away. You'll need more learned people than I to tell you when the endemic phase has begun. For me personally, I go about my daily life, I try to live it to the fullest, and I don't concern myself too much with COVID-19 anymore. No, I don't know if I've had it, but by God, most everyone I know has. And I make no distinction between fully vaxxed people and unvaxxed people. I know a few of them too. The reason I'm raising this again is that social media is once again full of preachers. In fact, a relative of mine beat social media to it a week or so ago when she told me that not taking all of my shots was counter to public health expectations that everyone do their part. My view is different. And it has to do with not putting something into my body if I feel it may not help or potentially even hurt me. I know people who have had various reactions. Reactions in some are to be expected. In one case, the reaction was death, and that was in a young person with no known health issues. That's one of the reasons I called a personal halt to this. I'll take the flu vaccine once that's being dispensed. I'll keep thinking about any more COVID juice. But people I don't know are on social media being outrageous. In one case, someone posted a picture of a reasonably young adult male who apparently died of COVID. The post admonished people who wouldn't or didn't mask for being irresponsible. I don't think they were. It's like someone recently vaccinated having a heart attack and someone saying that the person died as a side effect of the injection. Both the mask scenario and the heart attack issue could be true. But both of them could be tantamount to suggesting that someone who drops dead in the middle of drinking a glass of milk died from drinking it. None of this is verifiable. There are so many threads about vaccines and alleged vaccine injuries. The problem for most people is this. Do you believe the government and its agencies telling you it's good for you and everyone else to get your next shot? I know what I'm going to read is anecdotal, but it's the top of a lengthy thread, and it's far from being a single outlier. So here's the tweet. I am a nurse. I am speaking up. Do not take the shot or the boosters. They will destroy your immune system and make you sick. Health authorities are not your friend. The leading cause of death everywhere is now unknown, ... It's the vaccine. In that same thread is a mother begging for prayers for her lovely, healthy 20-year-old daughter. The mom says her daughter got a COVID shot the other day because it was mandated for her field of study. She went into cardiac arrest and was airlifted to hospital where she died. I've heard this story before because the very same thing happened to the son of people I know personally. So I have no pronouncement to make on any of this. As I said, I'm just a reasonable guy with a working brain who happens to know of a few incidents and who reads a lot, a hell of a lot. And frankly, there's just too much inexplicable information for me to ignore it. We have the colder season around the corner where I live, and typically we see more colds and flu, and over the last few COVID years, more COVID in this period. A piece of me says, well, get the bivalent Omicron-specific shot or shots because there'll be more COVID. But there's another piece of me that says, hey, you know, a lot of people who have done just what public health wanted and still got COVID. I did not do what they wanted, and I prefer to take an array of supplements. I don't think anyone is going to escape getting COVID ultimately, and that includes me. But so far, I'm fine. Like everything else, we have decisions to make, and they're all individual. So no recommendations from me. I'll decide for myself, and well, you do you. I'm Peter Shurman. What would an episode of Shurman Unlimited be without a smack at Justin Trudeau? Well, guess what? I'm not going to take a smack at him, at least not directly, but I am going to talk about climate change and taxation, and those things in the context of rampant inflation and Canadians now cutting back like meal portions, like watering down baby formula, like buying low-end merchandise or bruised fruit, like not fixing something in your home that you really need to fix. You all know what I'm talking about. I am clearly conservative in my thinking. I go out of my way not to condemn others for their way of thinking. I'm highly offended by people, however, who think I'm not as bright, perhaps, as them because I would vote for Pierre Poilievre right now. I'd do it tomorrow if there were an election tomorrow and not for Justin Trudeau. The Trudeau Liberals spent some time being attacked for tax increases during the past week. They're tripling the carbon tax and upping CPP and EI premiums. Tax increases and government putting its gigantic hand in your pocket and grabbing are the last things Canadians need at this time. Making ends meet is becoming an ever-increasing problem for a growing number of citizens. Not talking about those who don't want to work and expect to live off the fat of the land. I'm talking about everyday people who have never lived lavishly, work on a budget, may not have luxury in their lives, but who have always been able to pay the rent or the mortgage, feed and clothe the kids, put gas in the car, keep the house in good repair. These people are taking a shit-kicking. We all are. Some are more able to withstand it than others. So I ask this question. Is this the time for any government to be moving forward with tax increases? And in so doing, should the government be telling us that we will do without because our primary concern must be climate change, when the fact is that Canada has 1.8% of the allocated responsibility in the world? So if we pay more taxes, which are ostensibly used to assist in reducing greenhouse gases, is that okay with you? Or more correctly, is that okay with you right now? Here's an exchange from late in the week between Poilievre and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Listen for yourself. His question is not smarmy. It's plain language, simple, and accurate. He asks about Canadians now experiencing real food insecurity. Listen.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The government has been draining the paychecks and pocketbooks of Canadians. Just this week, the Angus Reid Institute published a poll showing that 51% of Canadians are struggling to eat. In Canada, a G7 country, the majority of people cannot afford groceries. That is 7 years of this Liberal government. Canadians are out of money. This government is out of touch. Why won't they cancel their tax hikes so Canadians can afford to eat?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you know who's out of touch? The people who are out of touch are a party that believes it's a good idea to slash our pensions and to undermine the EI system. You know what else is out of touch? It's out of touch not to have a plan to act on climate. And you know why that's out of touch, Mr. Speaker? Because our customers, our clients, the US and the EU, they are taking climate action. They will only buy Canadian products if we take climate action.
Does she ever really answer? She wants our clients, she says the EU and the United States specifically, to continue to buy from us and claims they won't if we don't carry our weight on the climate file. I'm not going to question climate change. All you have to do is look at the magnitude of recent hurricanes, and you'll know it's not the 60s climatically anymore. You want to discuss how much climate change there's been over the last 10,000 years on this planet and how much it had to do with human activity before there were any significant or abnormal emissions of CO2? We can do that sometime. For today, let me just say that people are struggling. The same government that zealously printed and handed out big money during COVID, then sent demand letters asking for much of it back, is the one that's showing no mercy. Deputy Prime Minister Freeland says we need to keep up with other countries on climate change, to the extent that we all have to pay much more tax without relating that to what it's going to do to kids and families. I am actually shocked, and I'm amazed, and I'm hopeful that they'll see what they're doing. Climate change, yes, try your best, but not to the extent that young children have to go to bed hungry. I'm Peter Shurman. Here in Canada last week, something called National Truth and Reconciliation Day was celebrated. This special day occurs every September 30th. Created through the actions of a survivor in 2013, it honors kids who were victimized in so-called residential schools, as well as their families and communities. The government believes that public commemoration of the pain caused in and by residential schools is a vital component of the reconciliation process. I have no issue with our Indigenous population, never have, never will, but I think the residential schools issue has been made crystal clear. Residential schools were not created to inflict pain, though in fact they did. Children were forcibly taken from their parents and in many cases abused by a system that employed people of Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and other religious backgrounds to teach and administer the schools, which, by the way, were still up and running in modern history, even when the father of our current Prime Minister was in office. They were paid for by the Canadian government. The term residential makes these places sound different. They were, in essence, boarding schools, though they were not voluntary. All we have ever been told is of the harm done to these kids and their families, as indeed there was harm. But here's the thing. Without them, there would have been little to no education for many of these kids at all. Having read a memoir by one of the country's great Indigenous authors recently, I learned that by and large, he and his mates had a reasonably good time of it. He went on to higher education and has achieved fame and notoriety following his time in residential school. There's a lot of background in his writings about life outside of school. In his far northern village, he acquired a lot of skills related to living off the land, but not much in the way of formal teaching or learning of other aspects of life. math, languages, music, from which he derived great pleasure and ability later in life. However, one could argue that something was stolen from these kids because white people alone decided unilaterally what indigenous kids needed, and it was to be raised like the rest of us, when in fact they were a people unto themselves who had done well with nature and their world before our ancestors ever arrived. That said, the schools and the system were created for what those who lived 100+ years ago believed to be good reason: to enhance the lives of young Native children beyond trapping and fishing as a central point of their existence. This story is often told in a very negative way. It leads us to believe the schools were designed solely to inflict pain and to force-feed those who attended a life neither they nor their families wanted. Some of that is obviously true, but some of it not so much. The Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs in 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, said this, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to be continuously protecting a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department," unquote. By today's standards, that's blatantly racist. By 1920 standards, Mr. Scott obviously thought there was an Indian problem, in his words, and that the schools would correct it. So much for motivations, right? Sadly, the concept of providing an education was not a badly intentioned one, but when it came to replacing the cultural and religious backgrounds of children with those of Euro-Canadians, things went to hell. Some of the schools were good, most were not. I could talk about humiliation, beating, sexual abuse, starvation. Yes, those things did happen, but so did a few good things depending on what school you were in and where it was located. The last of the residential schools closed in 1996, relatively recently. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized in the House of Commons, and he said this, quote, "The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some saw it, as it was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions that have created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermined the ability of many to adequately parent their own children and sowed the seeds for generations to follow," unquote. I accept that the country erred in its approach. Canada could have offered a good education to willing Indigenous families for their children without the imposition of culture and mores that they neither wanted nor needed. And it certainly could have done so without sexual depravity, beatings, lockups, starvation, but it didn't. Harper apologized, but we can't take what happened back. I look at the Canada of past generations, and even in my own family, I see events that would never have occurred in today's world. I look at Canada, and I believe we've moved on. I look at Canada, and I think that pretty much everyone here, either themselves or through ancestry, came from strife or hardship to make a better life. Irish people escaped starvation from famine. European Jews fled the Nazis, arriving as refugees. Immigrants today are Ukrainians seeking a new life, not death in war. The same for Middle Eastern immigrants. My point is that the before time is almost never as good as the current time. As a species, humans strive to improve life for themselves and their fellow men. We make mistakes doing so, and if we're good people, we apologize officially, and we did. So for me, I wish every Indigenous person well, but I do not apologize to anyone for any injustice committed by leaders from the past. I strive to ensure that all Canadians have the full range of equal opportunity, which a country like ours should, and I believe now does, afford everyone. I'm Peter Shurman.
Shurman Unlimited.
Let Peter know what's on your mind. Drop him an email. info@petershurman.com.
Find future episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts. So if you like what you've heard, tell a friend. If you really liked it, tell 3 friends. If you really hated it, tell 3 enemies. We'll talk again soon.